Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our January 14th cold edition of our PBIS Leaders Network. We're really excited you guys are here with us today. Really nice to see some smiling faces on camera there. We haven't seen some of you folks for a while, and so it's good to see you guys here this morning. And so we are recording. Just be aware we're recording, and this recording will be available hopefully sometime this afternoon, and I'll make sure to get it out to our network contacts. So good morning and welcome in. Stacy has been popping into the chat both the sign-in and the access to the link for today's materials. Please make sure you grab those. Just as a reminder, if you are attending these sessions and you are getting attendance for them, you can always bundle these contact hours with other things that you do with the state support team or the Summit ESC to get CEUs and actually Ashland credit. So that's always always available to you. And then again, there is the link for today's material. So if you guys are bundling, there's information at the end of this slide deck that show you how you can bundle those to get Ashland credit. So we're going to start with a quick connect. You guys know if you're on these calls that I am a huge fan of the first 5. I'm always pulling things from there. So we're going to do a quick connect just because it's been a while since we've gotten together. I think November was our last meeting. So we would, in the chat, if you would put in what would be part of your dream house, a home theater, a dance studio, a pool or a hot tub, sport court, a game room, or a music studio. If you would just kind of entertain me this morning and go ahead and put that in. Home theaters, 3. A lot of pool and hot tub. That's awesome. Game room. I kind of like that too. Game room, sport court. Awesome. I have one that I really, really want. Okay. More. Okay. Thank you. More of the game room, a lot of sport court I see, and a lot of hot tub and pool as well. Mine would probably be 6 because I love music and I think I would love to have although I don't know if I could make the music, I would maybe like to have one in my house. So thank you for connecting, and wouldn't it be nice if we could have all of those things in our dream home? All right, so let's move on to today's agenda. We have our MTSS presentation that's going to start momentarily. Following that, we have a couple of tools for you or a resource for you based on the content that we're talking about today. There are some MTSS resources we'd like to share with you. And then for those of you that are staying on for the high school, that networking, that will start at 10 at the same link. I had some requests could we maybe start doing that again. And so we'll see how it goes today, but there may be people not joining until 10. But for those of you that want to stay on for the high school piece of it, we will be doing some networking. We don't really have anything planned necessarily as far as a standard agenda, but we are going to be meeting together for the high school networking at 10 o'clock. So please stay on if you're interested in that. And we will have some discussion about specific high school issues as it pertains to PBIS. So again, I always like to show you the priorities for the state, which is Future Forward Ohio. Anything that we're talking about in our PBIS network or with PBIS in general will fall into the priority number 4 for the state, and that is student wellness. And so that's really providing all of those structures so that students are healthy and safe in schools and ready to learn. So I always do like to continue to come back to that because those are our state priorities. So without further ado now, we're going to jump right into our MTSS presentation. And that is going to be presented today by Michelle Neisen, who is the principal of Layton Elementary School in Aurora. And joining her will be Laura Arders, who is the MTSS coordinator there. And I am going to throw it to them. Their presentation is linked on this slide. They have a separate presentation, so you can get to the presentation by clicking on that link. And Michelle, I'm going to ask, do you want to share your screen, or would you like me to share my screen and continue?
You can go ahead, Heidi. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. If you can go ahead and you can share your screen, that would be great.
Awesome.
All right. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us this morning. Myself, Michelle Neisen, as Heidi said, I'm the principal over at Layton Elementary, the proud principal here. And I am joined today with my MTSS coordinator, Laura Arders.
Good morning.
And we're pretty excited today to talk a little bit about multi-tiered systems of support, and what does that look like and sound like in Aurora. We also know that every district is a little bit different as far as resources. So we're actually going to talk about our system, but then talk about maybe have some conversations about how you could translate these applications, resources, practices into your own or embed some of them. So our learning targets today is I want to really start by talking about MTSS and student achievement and this framework of multi-tiered systems of support. I think we were all been around since we talked about IAT, right? When we were talking about individual kids and their needs and how we could support them. Then, of course, we morphed into that response to intervention or RTI model, where we got a little bit better about talking about research-based interventions linked to measurable goals and then progress monitoring those goals over time. And then, of course, as we know, the state loves that alphabet soup. So now we're in this phase of multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that framework and the bigger picture of that, as far as from how we do this in Aurora from our district lens. And I love visuals. I'm a visual learner. And I was telling Heidi, I just had a staff meeting this morning and it was on UDL, kind of bringing us back to some of those things we do at a tier 1 level. And we were talking about how MTSS is a big part of that. So I'm going to talk about the big picture of MTSS and how that fits into Aurora, how we align that to district goals, curriculum goals, and then also our building goals. And then we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about, again, that MTSS framework being the PBIS portion, so our environments, and then also the RTI or academic portion. I do have some resources that we hope, Laura and I tried to link in today that we hope will be helpful for everybody. I always like things that I can take away from meetings and, utilize or mold and shape to, where we're at in our district. So we're going to share with you an MTSS handbook. Laura has been instrumental in pulling all of these wonderful things that we've been doing over the years together. And it's nice to have a one-stop shop to do that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some tier 2 behavior support. So we're going to talk about the big lens of MTSS with academics, and then also talk a little bit about our tier 2 behavior supports. Check in, check out is a pretty big thing right now. It always has been, I think, in our region, but it's a really wonderful tier 2 practice, and we've seen some really great results with kids. So where do we start? We always start with the big picture. So when I think about in Aurora, our strategic vision really guides what we do. And we have something called 6 competencies. Different districts have different, portrait of a graduate or things that they utilize that starts, with our superintendents and assistant superintendents, and our strategic vision really does guide our work here in the district. So we have 6 competencies. You're looking at our portrait of a learner here, and we always talk about being innovative, being collaborative, being empathetic, resilient, balanced, and being critical thinkers. So, that is the what we want students to be able to exemplify by the time they leave us. And then our design specs really talk about environments and how we want to shape those environments. I didn't include those here, but we talk a lot about being beyond points and grades, about identifying or supporting kids through nurturing great relationships. And we talk about innovation. So just some of those design specs that we talk about, but that really guides, that foundation or the house. So as we get to the next slide, thinking about big picture of MTSS, I always love visuals. I think visuals just help kind of put things into perspective. So when I rolled MTSS out to our staff, I talked about it in the sense of our building framework, but then also our district framework. So that strategic mission and vision is at the top. It's made up of our design specs and our 6 competencies. And then underneath that, we have our MTSS process. So there's 2 pieces to that. We have our RTI process, the academics, curriculum and instruction, and then we have our environments and how we're supporting kids in those environments with creating relationships and having those best practices. And a lot of the things we talk about in our PBIS meetings with our morning meetings and all of those best practices to really support the social emotional learning standards and support student behavior on each tier. So when we think about that house and how it houses curriculum instruction and environment, the curriculum and instruction side there on the left, you can see we have our frameworks. That's our reading, our writing, our science, our ELA, and that leads into interventions or our RTI process. Then we also have our environment and what we do to create those wonderful learning spaces for students. So we think about then how over time that is translated into our social emotional learning standards and tiered supports for students, tier 1 level, but then also tier 2 and consequently tier 3. So that's our PBIS. Those two things, our RTI and our PBIS, create our MTSS structures. So everybody's seen this pyramid, and Laura, my MTSS coordinator, really talks a lot about, and I think our staff has seen this many, many times. Everybody here is pretty familiar with it, but I'm going to turn it over to Laura just to briefly talk about how we have talked about this with our staff.
Okay, so when we're looking at that pyramid, we're thinking about the needs of all of our students in the building. And so we'll start at the bottom with universal interventions. These are interventions that most students will need in the classroom, about 80 to 90%. And so we're really working on that in our building in order to differentiate instruction for all students and provide best practice instruction. Then climbing up that pyramid, we see targeted group interventions. That is really kids who are at risk. And we glean that information from our universal screeners. So 3 times a year, we give a universal screener in Aurora. We use Ames Web. And we focus on those kids who score below the 25th percentile on those assessments. We're actually giving those this week for the winter benchmark. And then we take the lowest 25% and we give diagnostic assessments to find out, where there are some skill gaps. Students who qualify then enter our tier 2 interventions for math and for reading. And although we don't have a universal screener for behavior, we can glean from information collected by the teachers and interventionists, a targeted group of students who could utilize intervention for SEL at that tier 2 level. And then finally, at the top of the pyramid, those are our students who receive specialized instruction. And that should be at the very top of the pyramid. So 1 to 5% of the school environment, and hoping that these students have really exhausted the other tiers of support before we can say with confidence that they need specialized instruction.
Thank you, Laura. So we're going to kind of, we're looking at big picture. Now we're going to kind of get a little bit more microscopic and come into, we talked about big picture of MTSS. And now we're going to talk about how some of that, those district goals and that district framework now plays into, as a principal, some of our building goals. So I have instructional leaders, and my instructional leaders and I really sit down together over the summer before the year starts. We talk about some of these great systems for our students. We talk about UDL. We talk about MTSS. We talk about how we want to continue to support each of those levels. So this is one of the areas under what we call gap closure, and resilience is one of our competencies. So we align again to our, strategic vision, within the district. And our goal, as an example for everyone, was this year to continue to use and refine our MTSS process and our meetings to collaboratively meet the needs of all students, work to close the gaps through early and research-based interventions. So that sounds like a great goal. And we kind of drilled down a little bit. How do we want to continue to do that? And today we're going to show some examples of this. We really want to ensure what we call 2A interventions, and we also have 2B interventions. What we call 2A interventions are classroom-based interventions, and they want to making sure those are in place to support our universal design for learning practices that we use within the classrooms. That's one of the big ones. We want to support staff in implementing those 2As through 2A check-ins. So having a Laura Arders is not typical. Not every district may have an MTSS coordinator. We are very blessed to be able to have that, but she is very instrumental in helping me to ensure those things happen and continuing to support staff and creating a good coaching model to make sure that we're supporting staff with what is the data showing us, how can we create a measurable goal based on a skill deficit, and then how are we applying a research-based intervention to support that targeted area. And lastly, how are we progress monitoring that over time? We're going to talk about each of those pieces to that and the forms that we use to streamline that and make it easy for teachers. Our last number C, their goal or piece of that goal, as far as gap closure, is ensuring that our MTSS meeting framework is utilized to support diagnostic conversations at MTSS meetings. We've really had a lot of conversations as an MTSS team about how we continue to refine these practices so that our conversations are very diagnostic in nature, and we're really drilling down to what the kids need. And we're supporting staff with that data piece and how to implement those research-based interventions. So in the next few slides, we're going to talk about 2A, but before we do that, Heidi, could you go back for 1 minute? Thank you. There is one link there called a decision-making tree. If districts don't have this, Laura, I'm going to turn this back over to Laura to talk about what that process looks like. Again, big picture, we're going to drill down into how we make decisions because it is really important to know how students move through tiers of support and how our MTSS process can help to do that.
So one of the key components of MTSS is having this decision-making tree and having systems in place where administrators and teachers, parents can look to for guidance. And it ensures equity. So one of the things that we came up with was our MTSS decision-making tree. And you could see at the top, that is where your core instruction takes place at Tier 1. This is where we want to see implementation of UDL practices. We want to see teachers collecting their universal screening data and being very diagnostic in looking at that data and seeing where students could benefit from what we call 2A intervention. And you could see that's where that branches off on the left side. 2A intervention is very simple. It's just a classroom-based intervention. It differs from UDL practices in that teachers who are collecting or implementing, I should say, a 2A intervention are collecting data and progress monitoring on a weekly basis. So it is a specific targeted skill deficit that the student is exhibiting through diagnostic testing that originates from the universal screener. And the teacher is intentionally designing an intervention and then collecting data on a weekly basis. So that's at the Tier 1 level, and the intervention in Aurora is 2A. That's what we call it. If a student needs more than that, then they receive 2B intervention, which is at the Tier 2 level. And any student receiving a Tier 2 intervention also receives a Tier 1 intervention, or that 2A intervention that I was talking about. It's very important for the specialist who is delivering the Tier 2 intervention to be in line with the classroom teacher and the intervention that they are delivering. So it's a true double dose. So a student might be working with the teacher at the table, for example, 3 days a week for a few extra minutes when the teacher's meeting with their group, and they might be engaging in that systematic intervention. When they go to tier 2, that's typically 3 to 5 days a week in our district. It's a 30-minute time slot with a specialist in math or reading, or sometimes students need both. And the specialist is highly trained, and they are delivering a research-based intervention. And that's really important, that the intervention be research-based. And we are now striving to deliver, now I just lost my train of thought. Evidence-based, that's what I wanted to say. Evidence-based interventions. So students receive both of those things. The tier 2 specialist is progress monitoring along the way and collecting as much data as possible. And when it comes to those MTSS meetings, the entire team will meet. So the team includes the specialist, the classroom teacher, an administrator, the school psychologist, the school counselor, and it may include a speech and language pathologist. It may include a special ed intervention specialist. So it is many, many components of that team. The coaches are also involved, the academic coaches, and our behavior coach is involved in those meetings as well. So you can imagine that when a child's name is brought up and all of those people are at the table, we have rich conversations about what we can do to ensure that that child is successful. Sometimes that may mean that we need to move to further testing. And so that's where our school psychologist comes into play. And he may need to give further testing to a student and see whether or not that they qualify for tier 3, which is our special education intervention services.
Thank you, Laura. So as you can see, believe it or not, we are still in like kind of the big picture phrase here, but wanted to share what we've created over time, just that MTSS decision tree. I'm sure many districts have this, but if you don't, it is a really great way when you're rolling this out to your staff, so everybody's just on the same page, understands the processes in place. So then the next slide is sort of going in, and again, we're going to get into the microscope of things. So we talked a lot about big picture process. We're going to talk more specifically about what it looks like and sounds like, some of the focuses within the MTSS process. Then we're going to highlight our 2As, and we're going to show you exactly, as we've said, those are classroom-based interventions. We're going to show you what our 2A form looks like as an easy way, because this sounds, even talking about it, like a lot of stuff, right? And we think about ways that we can continue to support our teachers and making sure that this is manageable, within the classroom for them, for students. And we spent a lot of time in collaboration creating some forms that we feel will be able to do that, allow us to tackle those things of documenting a measurable goal, applying research-based interventions towards that targeted goal, and then, of course, that tricky part of progress monitoring over time. So on this slide, when we think about MTSS, as Laura said when she was talking about the decision tree, it's a team that's comprised of our teachers. We do have 2B specialists, as she alluded to. We are also going to talk about 2B and what that framework looks like. Our MTSS coordinator, which is Laura. We also know we're very lucky. We have an ELA and a math district coach. So those folks are also involved in those conversations with students for ELA and math. Of course, I'm there, my assistant principal, and we work together. And I think this is the most important piece of defining what we do. We make team decisions based on the data to support each learner's unique needs. So we want to be sure that, we're hearing all those voices, all of those folks that, are specialized in those lenses to make the best decisions we can to support our kids and gap close. The systematic overview, some of the things we talk about at that tier 1 level, we want to look at how are we looking at our data holistically to support tier 1 instructional practices. That's always the goal of MTSS. We want to strengthen the core, make sure that core is strong. So we always start with tier 1. And how are we, some of the questions we ask teachers when we're in meetings, how are we flexibly grouping? How are we differentiating for students' needs based on that data and looking at the data holistically? How are we supporting students, student-led learning? How are students engaged in those self-assessments and goal-setting pieces? When I talk with teachers about that, I also talk about how we're not just doing these things in isolation. We're not doing MTSS, but rather we are thinking about MTSS within a framework and within a bigger framework. Our teacher evaluations, for example, right? MTSS and UDL practices and looking at our data, how we're differentiating, all that is encompassed in there. So our focus, when we think about it, is we want to make sure that the data analysis and our data and being data informed leads to being data diagnostic. And we hear a lot about data, but we try to keep it simple, for staff, and the simpler we can make it, the better. We work on our 2A implementation with fidelity because, again, we want that tier 1 to be very strong. So we really spend a lot of time over the years supporting our teachers through what we call a good coaching model and making sure to remove any barriers that are there, to completing forms or to finding research-based interventions. We do what's called 2A checks to support staff with interventions. So those happen every 4 weeks, where if, based on the data, the teachers have looked at their data once they do their universal screener, which for Aurora, we use Ames Web. And when they see those students who are performing on target, that's great. We know that the instruction is working, what we're doing. When we see kiddos that are not performing or not hitting that target, we know we have to do something a little more for them. Those students may be on a 2A, so teachers know that they're going to be supporting some of those kids and determine who those students are, and then work with them in small groups during a win time, which we have built into our building schedule. Even if it's an ELA, sometimes we do guided reading and guided reading small group work. Sometimes teachers utilize that time as well, because time is always something of the essence when we think about interventions and how we fit that into a busy day. Our MTSS meeting framework is also in place, so we want to support staff, interventions, action planning, and really move students forward. And like we talked about, that's comprised of our 2A and 2B. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about those two things. So I'm going to start with 2A, and then Laura's going to start a little bit with 2B. How's everybody doing? We're doing a lot of talking. It's a lot of information. Everybody feeling pretty good? Are there any questions? I'll pause for a minute and ask if there's any questions.
Feel free to pop stuff in the chat. I haven't seen anything in the chat, or feel free to unmute if you have a question for Michelle or for Laura. And we have some positive feedback. Love hearing the philosophy and the process. So that's a good reinforcement, Michelle.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, we'll keep moving along, and then we'll stop at the end, pause for sure. I started the presentation saying, we are very blessed and lucky. We have a lot of resources, but what can this look like, and how would that translate if you don't have those resources? So we're going to talk through a little bit of that too. So we talked about this 2A and this 2B. So 2A interventions, as we talked about, is classroom-based interventions, and they're instituted by the classroom teacher with progress monitoring that is built in to ensure implementation with fidelity over 4 to 6 weeks. So we really want to make sure we're honing in on what students' needs, and we're progress monitoring that progress over time. We also make sure that we can support our teachers. I think anytime, you have anything, it's really important to have a good coaching model in place. And that takes years. It doesn't just happen in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Sometimes it's a 3 to 5 year process where you're continuing to refine the great things you do, and making sure to include staff in on, feedback forms and what they feel like they need. I know I meet with my MTSS team really regularly, especially after 2A check-ins and MTSS meetings, and we talk about what were the strengths of that meeting, what was the areas that we need to continue to refine, what information did we hear? Sometimes we have really tough conversations, and I love tough conversations and difficult conversations because from that we usually come up with some really great ideas. So those are all positives. At the 2A check-in meetings with the specialists, again, we want to support the teacher in applying research-based interventions, tracking the data consistently based on a targeted skill deficit. One of the things I want to share today is our 2A script is what we're calling that there. This is a great form, super teacher friendly, because it's like, okay, it can be hard. We all remember what it's like to be an educator. I think I never lose sight of that in all of the different paperwork to do and the kids in the room and all the demands of the day. So I always try to think, about where the teachers are at and how we can best support them and what feedback we're getting from them with the process. So this form was created to identify for teachers in the areas of ELA, math, and behavior. What are the areas of concern? So you can see there, we have a learning continuum for ELA, learning continuum for math, and some different kinds of behaviors or things we might be seeing. Teachers usually check off if there's a concern or if we've done our universal diagnostic or screener, and they're able to identify this is a low area for the student. I need to hone in on this. We identify the assessment that's used to determine the deficit. So we all know AIMS-Web for us, again, is our universal screener. But then we also have different ELA assessments that we use that are state approved, that are best practices, research-based. And you can see them identified there for ELA, math, and also, just different behavior. Behavior is a little more gray, as we all know, but we really try to streamline those processes as well for our MTSS process. So teachers identify area of concern, the assessment they used, and then they create a targeted goal. It may sound silly, but you can see there I have an example. I think sometimes, SMART goals have been around for a long time. When we're asking teachers to create a goal, keep it simple. Less is sometimes more, but being very clear is kind. So we want to make sure we're being very clear with how to create a goal and what we're measuring. So we just created a very simple, the student will be able to increase his fluency skills to, and you can see there 68 words per minute in the next 4 weeks through a targeted 2A and 2B intervention 4 times a week. Just creating a little bit of a parameter to help teachers know how to create a targeted goal. And then obviously having those conversations with them as well. You can see below that, there's a 2A intervention and frequency. So what are we doing and how often are we doing that? And we provided an example there. Maybe we're doing repeated readings 3 to 5 times a week. And then if that student is also receiving a 2B, and we're going to talk about that lens in a minute, the 2B specialist will be a part of this team collaboration and be sharing what they're doing in tandem with the teacher, because we want to align our efforts and our intervention to support that targeted skill gap. So that we're getting the best results for our kids. So you can see there that the 2B specialist has a place that they can write down what they're doing as well. And then how we're progress monitoring. Are we doing quick checks? Are we using AIMS-Web? Are we using running records, a comprehension interview? Some of those things that we've identified in our district are good progress monitoring tools. Below that, you can see then the intervention log and progress monitoring data. Easy peasy, right? We want to click some check marks. When am I doing this? A Monday, Wednesday, Friday, a Tuesday, Thursday, and you can see there, and then teachers can just jot down for us, what they're doing and how is that progress monitoring going. So for example, we talked about fluency with the goal. An example would be increase in fluency, 37 words per minute with a baseline of 35, for example. We've had lots of conversations about progress monitoring data and what kind of things to collect. So again, in your conversations in your district, just keeping it simple based on the tools you're using, the diagnostics you're using, and the progress monitoring tools. But this is a 2A check-in form that we use that teachers would utilize for their students. And we found that it works really nicely. It's not inundating for the teachers. But again, rolling it out in a systematic way is probably the reason why for a good amount of success. And of course, we still, we remind teachers and we support them with how to fill out those forms right before a 2A check-in. So that's a little bit about 2A. If we find that students need further support, our mantra is everything goes through MTSS. So MTSS is that vehicle to support our kids. So if teachers have concerns and they're implementing a 2A for 4 to 6 weeks, and they find, you know what, I maybe my student's having success. So they might change, their intervention because they're having success with that one, but then they're going to move on to the next skill in that progression and hone in on that. And then they're doing great. The student might stay on a 2A. If this teacher finds, okay, I'm working on this and working on this, I've changed the intervention to a different one, it's still not working for me, they bring the student to MTSS. We have a bigger team conversation based on data. And the team, as a team, we might decide through eligibility criteria, which we're going to talk about next, that the student may need further support and 2B may be needed. So I'm going to turn this over to Laura, who's going to talk about what 2B intervention is, and then eligibility criteria for determining how students move through these tiers.
Okay, so beginning with the eligibility criteria, again, we look to our universal screener, which is Ames Web. And if we're looking at reading, for example, any child below the 25th percentile will get further diagnostic testing. So what does that look like? We might give a child a running record. We might go through the core phonics assessment, and we might determine that a child has some phonics gaps. We might look at that universal screener and see that the oral reading fluency score was intact and it looked good. Vocabulary was intact and looked good, but comprehension was a little bit lower. So maybe we would give the mosaic of thought comprehension interview in order to be more diagnostic with comprehension. So once we determine if that child has holes in those specific areas, whether it be comprehension or phonics or fluency, then we may enter a child into tier 2 support or 2B intervention. 2B intervention is going to use a research-based intervention in order to try to close the student's gaps. It is delivered by a highly skilled specialist in the area of reading or math, and the child meets with the specialist for approximately 30 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week. The 2B specialist is collecting data once a week. So for example, if a student is receiving the intervention called UFly to target phonics skills that were revealed to us by the core, which would be the diagnostic assessment, then we are using the UFly check-ins at the end of every week in order to progress monitor that student. We also take another step and we progress monitor using Ames with the oral reading fluency. There's actually a progress monitoring piece to Ames, and it gives prompts, weekly prompts, that we can monitor a student's fluency progress, which, as you know, is highly tied to phonics. In conjunction with our Tier 2 services, the classroom teacher then is working in their classroom with a 2A intervention, and that is directly supporting the 2B intervention. So in the case of a student who has a phonics deficit, the 2B specialist and the teacher are working on the same phonics patterns so that they are truly getting a double dose of what they need. A similar structure is put in place for math, and a similar structure is put in place for behavior as well. When we come together as a team at our MTSS check-ins in our meetings, we can determine if the intervention is successful and if we are going to discontinue the intervention, if we are going to intensify it, if we're going to change it in any way. And with everybody being around that table together as a team, we can make those decisions together. Okay, so here we see a slide with the MTSS eligibility criteria for that tier 2 or 2B, as we call it here in Aurora. As you heard me say before, if a student scores in the limited or basic range, which is below that 25th percentile on the universal screener, then that is one piece of data that we collect. We also look at the OST scores in the previous year to determine, how that child proceeded on that particular test as well. And then we also look at specific areas of our universal screener. So in math, we may look at that concepts and applications piece, which is very, very telling for problem solving. If we move to tier 2, or excuse me, to number 2 on that slide, diagnostic screener results, we can see that for math, we are giving the CBA, cognitive-based assessment. It is aligned with the grade level, and it is an assessment, a diagnostic assessment that gives students problems that will determine if they are at grade level or not for all of their skills in math. So again, it's working on a continuum. And if the student is showing gaps on the continuum for math, then they are brought into 2B to work with a math specialist to close those gaps. Progress monitoring takes place on a weekly basis. And then when we come together as a team, we can determine whether or not to move that child to further support, or if we need to reduce support because they're doing relatively well.
Okay, I want to push pause for just a minute. There's a lot of information as we put together here in these slides. Does anyone have any comments, reflections, suggestions, questions, anything like that? We talked a lot about process. We talked a lot about our 2As and our 2Bs and eligibility criteria.
Again, you can utilize the chat or come off of mute.
Thank you. I see in there. Thank you so much, Lauren. It sounds like a lot. Laura and I worked really hard to be as concise as we can, but also really give some good introspection into how we've refined our processes over time and how we continue to have conversations to do that, based on staff feedback, based on things that we're coming up against in meetings. It's just a very important thing to constantly be a learner. We talk about that in education. I always tell the staff I'm a lead learner. It's so important that we're all continuing to learn and grow in this field, and we have great conversations about how we can continue to grow processes too based on feedback. Okay, so thank you for the feedback so far. The next piece, and this is a little bit quicker as we wrap up, as we talked about, MTSS is that academic piece, curriculum, and RTI process, right? Plus our PBIS process. So what we do for behavior and how we're creating those environments that support kids. And we all know it's about relationships and creating those good relationships with students. So again, one of the great resources we have here, we have a behavior specialist. Aurora is one of the only places where I've had a behavior specialist as well, and she's wonderful. She is a K through 5 or K through 12 district behavior specialist and a BCAA. She's very supportive of our PBIS and comes to meetings when she can. And we work with her a lot on that tier 3, supporting our most highest needs kids. So what we've created over time in our K through 5 buildings, our elementary buildings, we call this a district K through 5 behavior framework. It mirrors the steps we talked about in MTSS with, the first line of defense will always be the core tier 1 classroom. So the teacher is going to be that first line of defense. We have something that I've created in this building. I'm sure many people have something like this where we call it a BIR, or a building incident report. As we know with PBIS, that's really important. We use a Google form. That Google form creates graphs for us that allow us to see, once the teacher fills them out, the incidences that is happening, or the behaviors that are happening, the locations of those behaviors, how many times it is occurring, what the response from the adult was in those situations, and then if it is a major or a minor. We are always looking at that data, just like we do for academics. The behavior mirrors the same process. So the teacher, will be monitoring the behavior in the classroom. They may use the BIR. If we start to notice in the BIR, we track that, as well as my counselors. We look at, how many minor incidences. If I see a teacher putting in 2 or 3 minor incidences, over the course of a week, or, the next week I see another 2, that's going to be a red flag for us. Even though they're minor incidences, we intervene right away. And my counseling department, when I have counseling meetings with them right away, we look and say, wow, what does that teacher need any support? Is there something we can help them do within the classroom on a tier 1 level that may help that student? Could be as easy as, once again, targeting the behavior, providing some sort of small intervention. Maybe it's just, we always say the sticker charts, right, as a go-to at a tier 1 level, but maybe it's just something where we're setting a goal with the student of I can use kind words, and we're helping that student to create self-regulation and co-regulation with his peers by creating a sticker chart where he keeps track of when he does that, he adds a smiley face to the chart. Something that simple, that can be very helpful to the classroom teacher. That's going to be step 1, where they're looking at that, creating some sort of a resource, and maybe they're documenting a 2A. You saw the 2A forms. They would document that under behavior. Here's what I'm doing. Step 2, with a 2A in place, maybe there's no change. Maybe it's getting worse, and they need to say, okay, at this point, I've tried an intervention for 4 to 6 weeks. I changed my interventions. I connected with the parents. Parents know what's going on, and it's not getting any better. I need to take this kid over to and support him through an MTSS process. So that teacher will sign up for MTSS and then bring that student to team. And we'll talk about, what interventions are in place. Do we need to change the intervention? Do we need to, look at changing some aspect of what that teacher is doing, or do we need to look at a tier 2 intervention? I had mentioned when we first started a check-in, check-out, that is just one, but there's a very high success rate with that intervention, and it is building wide in our building. So I will talk a little bit about that. And then step 3 is, once you have that, let's say you have a check-in, check-out in place for this student because the team came together, decided, you know what, this kid is really seeking attention. What is the function of the behavior? Maybe that's attention. Maybe the student needs, some additional reinforcement, some positive reinforcement, and check-in, check-out match that. So in step 3, maybe we have that in place, and we're doing a check-in every 4 weeks just to make sure that teacher has what they need. And we're noticing that, wow, this is intensifying, or this is getting worse. We might bring our behavior specialist then into that conversation and talk about if we need to look at something more intensive. Maybe we need to look at tier 3, which if you are implementing at a tier 3 level, we have created plans in conjunction with our behavior specialist called positive support plans that are very targeted, and they're a level below a BIP or an FBA, a functional behavior assessment, or a behavior intervention plan. So it's kind of that level below it. We're at like a tier 3. We're not, we're not into the special ed area yet. So the next slide really just defines what I went through. Tier 1 being the teacher develops the plan with PBIS support. Teacher is collecting data. Tier 2, we've now invited that team to come together to develop a plan, possibly a check-in, check-out. The case manager is still going to be the teacher there providing resources, but now that they've brought them to team, maybe Laura or myself will also be there to support the teacher and make sure we're checking in on those areas. The teacher's still taking the data. And then tier 3, we have now, reached a level where we're going to invite our behavior specialist in. Maybe we need to develop, again, a PSP plan. We call them positive behavior supports. And that's our tier 3 level plan that is more intensive. And the behavior specialist will be supporting more, providing resources, check-ins. And again, the teacher is still tracking the data. So these are 2 resources that I even mentioned at the beginning. We did pull all this together, and I won't go through this with everybody right now, but if you're ever interested, our MTSS handbook, Heidi, if you just click on that resource, and if you scroll down, the table of contents here goes through much more in-depthly some of our curriculum design at a tier 1 level, how we've utilized professional development for staff, our response to intervention within the building, and you will find a lot of resources here on a tier 1 level, 2As, on a tier 2 level, 2Bs, and on a tier 3 level. This is certain, and then obviously parent involvement and all of that. So just something that I always try to think, what would be most helpful for districts, and what are some pieces and parts they may be able to look at. We can't go through all of that today, but you could take back and maybe supportive to your goals and where you're currently at in your building, even if it's just tier 1 or tier 2. So we're always a work in progress. That's what we always say. So we're constantly revising and reviewing that. And then I've also connected here to our tier 2 check-in, check-out. I did bring the team a few years ago to a training, and the check-in, check-out procedures are delineated here. We created this as a team based on evidence-based practices, and what the state recommends for a check-in, check-out process, including a teacher script, a parent script, keeping the students at the center, which is what we want to do with any intervention, so that they're becoming aware of their own behavior and what their goals are, and they're trying to meet goals. There's a progress monitoring or a data progress monitoring sheet included in here, and then also when to phase a student out of this intervention. So Heidi, if you click through slides there, let's see, go to slide 8. You can see there, this is one of the intervention graphs. Again, it is all in a PowerPoint presentation that can easily be pulled up, but this was just one of the ways, students can actually graph their progress with whoever their case manager is. I will say, even as a principal of the building, I love to be the check-in. I like to be the checkout person. I always want kids to see me as somebody who's going to cheerlead for them on their best days and sometimes on their not so great days. And, when I go to MTSS meetings, I'm a checkout person, Laura's a checkout person, and we like to celebrate those successes with our kids. And we have found when you bring this to light for them, you set a targeted goal, you keep that student at the center. It's a very student-centered conversation when you're creating a check-in, check-out. What do you think we need to work on, Johnny? And how are we going to accomplish this? Because I know you're going to be able to do this, and I want to cheer you on. And it's amazing to see just the script really flip when you create those opportunities for kids to take ownership. You empower them through their strengths, and they're also their areas of growth. So slide 10, Heidi, is one other slide of a check-in, check-out. Some ways to do that. I'm sure everybody has probably seen these before, but we align our 3 pillars that we talk about at a tier 1 to that. And then we create goals, obviously the student goal under it. And then it's a process of, how that student did in that class throughout the day. They're kind of rating themselves, but that person who is with them also rates them. So this is sort of like you set a measurable goal. You can see there we want to start at something attainable, like 80%, or maybe it's 70%, just to build that student's feeling good about themselves and feeling like they can do it. And then we always increase the goal as we go. So without saying too much, even though I already did with check-in, check-out, it's such a great intervention. It really works well when implemented with fidelity, and we see a very high success rate with students. And then lastly, to wrap things up here, we talked a lot about data. I just wanted to bring to light our building-wide data review and our PBIS team meetings. It's really important to share the data. We share it at a building level. We talk about it in our PBIS teams. We do data dives. So it's not just me going in and saying, here's what we're seeing with the data, but rather the team dives into the data. I ask very simple questions. What do you notice? What do you wonder? What are the generalizations we can make based on the data that we're seeing? And then what should our action steps be on a tier 1 level? So really quickly, Heidi, if you click on that link, you can see there, this was our BIR. It actually disaggregates the data in this manner so we can kind of see some follow-up action of different incidences that have happened. If you click on slide 4, for example, we created this. You might see minor behaviors. So we're able to see, okay, what percentage of minor behaviors are happening where, for example. And we can see that there's a number of things, at least in this data sheet, happening in the classroom. So then we might say, okay, I noticed that we're seeing a higher number in the classroom. I wonder if we can do something. Is it a structured time, an unstructured time? And how can we support that? Is there something we can do universally? Is there something we can do within the classrooms to help support in that time? So just as an example as to how we use the data to drive some of those data deep dives and have conversations.
Michelle, there was a question in the chat that says, can you, Dawn had asked, can you clarify what specialized staff mean?
Yes, absolutely. So specialists, our 2B specialists are staff that have reading and math. We're calling them specialists. They've been called tutors over time, but they're staff that work with our MTSS coordinator. So Laura's a reading specialist, for example. She's a MTSS coordinator, but she's also a reading specialist. We do have folks that specialize in math, so they were tutors within our building. We changed the titles from being tutors to specialists because they are so highly trained. And they are there to support students who need additional help in those areas. Laura, did you want to add anything?
I just wanted to add that I think it's really, really important that even if you don't have a specialist at your disposal in your district or an MTSS coordinator, you can always start small. And there's so many ways that you can do that, right? So UDL is the first place that I would go. Using that universal screener to determine students' deficits and create 2A or classroom-based interventions is where I would begin. And then slowly build a system that is strategic, that is in line with the district's vision, and that supports all students. I think that's what's most important.
And I think people have to realize too, this is years in the making. This does not
Yes.
happen overnight. We talk about just on the behavioral side, the research indicates it used to be, they used to say 3 to 5. Now they're saying 3 to 10 years to build these systems. So this is not something, it's amazing what you guys have done, but this did not happen in 1 year. This did not happen in 2 years. This did not happen overnight. So I think it's important for folks to know that. So as we kind of wrap up, I will open it up. Are there any other questions? Feel free to unmute or populate the chat for Michelle or Laura. I thank them so much for being with us this morning to share their process. It is involved, but it's such great information. And I think Laura's recommendation to start with those classroom practices as far as like universal design for all students to give all students access, I think is a great place to start. Well, Michelle, I'll ask if people have follow-up questions. I know your presentation is linked. I'm sure if folks have follow-up questions, they could reach out to you at Layton. Would that be okay?
Absolutely, 100%. I will put my information in the chat for everybody. Thank you for having us today. It's a lot of information, so much more to always talk about, of course, but if I can help with anything, please reach out to me. I'm happy to do that. So is Laura. We learn best when we learn from each other. So I appreciate each one of you here. And I thank you for your time and listening this morning.
Thanks so much. So just as we finish up, I won't spend too much time. There are a couple of resources at the end of the Leaders Chat Leader Network presentation. There are 1 and 2 are just very simple one-pagers if you want to share with your folks if you're starting this journey. The first one is more like what the process is. Number 2 is really about what are the essential components. And then number 3, that resource map is really a nice resource where you can look at your tiers of support and map your curriculum and your resources and your assessments. I really like that. So that's there for you. And then on the second page there, or on the second slide, is from the air from the AIR website, and that is I would call it like a TFI for MTSS. It is an implementation rubric and summary sheet that you could go through, that it will map the components like the screening, the progress monitoring, the database decision making, the multi-level prevention system, and there's a couple others, but it'll go through each of those and it allows you to score yourself and set some action steps. So that's all through AIR. Those are nationally researched and approved materials that are nationally used. So those are there for you as well. So thanks again to Michelle and Laura for being here. I'll leave you with our upcoming PD events just real quickly. Our Classroom Harmony is filling up, so if you're interested in attending that, I would register. And we're really excited about our Tools for Transformation on April 1st. That's going to be a restorative practices session.